We're doing the letter of the Vilna Gaon from 1897. And, I think what was interesting about it is that the Gaon, that everything is, as I mentioned yesterday, things really, the criticism of the Chasidim is different in this letter. It's not, now there's actually a letter that we read from the same period, from the 1790s, and it was from Minsk, was this letter. And this is 1790. Yeah, 1797. And in this, they had listed all of these other things, these earlier things, like not letting them have their own minyan, not letting them change the nusach, not eating the shechita. Now, so that was a little bit different than the very early things, which were, don't stand on your head, all of that, they're too joyous. That stuff has fallen away. But for the Vilna Gaon, it's really theological, I think. And that's what you see by by this time, by the 1790s. He was basically only talking about Kabbalah, the Hasidic belief that God is immanent in everything, that's what he's taking tremendous difference with. So this is a letter, and that was, of course, it goes back to the Baal Shem Tov and really the Arizal, these ideas. That's the thing. In a way, Chassidut is taking the ideas of the Ari, both the Sidur of the Ari, but also the Kabbalistic ideas of the Arizal, and bringing them forward. So it's interesting. Why isn't the Gaon sort of stuck with the Arizal? It's not. The Chassidut might be a new movement, but it's not like Rabbi Isaac Luria was new. He's from the 1500s. So, but this is a letter back. Basically, it's a response. It's the same year, and it seems to be a response to the Vilna Gaon's letter. In the introduction here, which is interesting, they say this letter is a response of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi to the Chasidim who live in Vilna. In other words, the Gaon wrote that, but there's still Chasidim. It's interesting, by the way, that the Chasidim were not run out of Vilna, or that 25 years before this, we have all of these announcements. They're not allowed to make a minyan, they're not allowed to do all these things, and yet it sounds like there certainly are Chasidim in Vilna. They asked Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi to come to Vilna in order to make peace with the Misnagdim. They wanted, I guess, the Chasidim in Vilna wanted Rabbi Shneur Zalman to come and have a polemical argument, public one with, I guess, with the Vilna Gaon, with the Misnagdim. Chasidei Vilna panu elav b'vakasha zeh be'etzem hamachama gedola shechu aleihem ach shiotzi ger sagra miyam yelav tishrei. So after the Vilna Gaon energized the fight against the Chasidim, so then the Chasidim of Vilna wrote to Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and he wrote back. Rabbi Shneur Zalman b'igarato in this letter that we're going to do. He says there's no reason to fight with the Vilna Gaon for four reasons. Because number one, kvar nasu nisyonos mitzido ibakechem agra, that the Vilna Gaon, that the Rabbi Shneur Zalman already tried in the 1770s to discuss this with the Vilna Gaon, and the Vilna Gaon did not agree. So why bother now? The Vilna Gaon has not changed his orientation toward the Chasidim. And even if you have a public debate, he's not going to change his mind. In Tam Levikuach, there's no reason to have a public debate. Kevan Shagra Inumamin Bakabal Sari. Very interesting. He says, because the Vilna Gaon does not believe in the Kabbalah of Rabbi Isaac Luria, of the Arizal, the Chalala Shehikula Mipi Eliyahu, ואילו עניין העלית ניצוצין מהקליפות שמובא בספרי חסידות ובמיוחד בספרי תניא, לא נזכר בכל סרי. And he says this idea that the Vilna Gaon is arguing with about the raising up of the sparks, God's immanence in the physical, which is talked about certainly in the Tanya, it comes from the Arizal. That's where it comes from. The Vilna Gaon, you're not going to get anywhere because he doesn't believe it. He doesn't believe in the source that it comes from. And it's, I guess, that the Arizal's Kabbalah, and we are very familiar with the Arizal's Kabbalah, but I guess what you realize is we're familiar with the Arizal's Kabbalah because of Chassidut. That's what popularized it. So the Arizal's Kabbalah was a very small and tight woven group of people. There was the Arizal, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. These were a group of early rabbis who were in Spain and left to go to Tzfat. Rabbi Abu Lafia. These were, it was called Kabbalah for a reason. It was not given to the people. But Chassidut does is it takes Kabbalah and it popularizes Kabbalah. And because of Vilna Gaon, he's saying doesn't agree with the Ariz's Kabbalah. So, it's not gonna help. We're just, we're taking an idea that he doesn't agree with, and we're spreading it out. Gambora wrote, Shel Beis Anashim Chashuvim Shiu Machrim Hadin Lo Tazor Kan Barbe. Ki haborer mitzad misnagdim, kamim yakir b'tzidkas hachasidim yachshosh lavi lahabaya et dato, ki ein bedin esluta mishi yirom levavenu levavo shalo levatel dato mevnei dato. He says, even if you win, this is Portuguese, he says, even if you win the public debate, it's not going to help because nobody is going to disagree with the Vilna Gaon. It's not like you're going to convince the people to change their minds. If the Gaon says something, that's it. He's the greatest person in the generation, and nobody's going to change their mind. So that's very interesting. He ends his letter that if there is room for a clarification between him and the Gaon, it's only going to happen if there are letters back and forth. And the rabbis all get together and agree to something, and then maybe there'll be peace. You would have to have people who really are familiar with the Kabbalah of Ari, like the Sephardim are. The Ari, of course, was a Sephardi, and there's a reason that they're using a nusach that is Sfard. Right? The Arizal's nusach is closer to Sfard because it has more Kabbalah in it. Bigarazo Bali de Bitoy Bolate Yishatam Shal V'Shlam Zalm Bagra. He says, when you read this letter, you see it highlights the path of the Vilna Gaon and Rabbi Shneur Zalman, for how they understand the Torah of the Arizal. So he says that the Vilna Gaon's method of study, which is in revealed things, to understand what is the pshat, what is the plain meaning of the text, that is also his approach when it comes to nistar, when it comes to hidden things, when it comes to Kabbalah, or understanding the Zohar or the Sefer Yetzirah. It's hard to imagine that you can understand the Sefer Yetzirah and that there is any pshat, but the Vilna Gaon understood the notion of tzimtzum. What is tzimtzum? Tzimtzum means to constrict, to contract. So the notion of tzimtzum is that God contracted. No, there's a big problem in theology, which is if God created the world, God is also infinite. How does the world exist? How do we exist? How can there be anything else besides God? But clearly there is. So there's a notion in Kabbalah that God constricted the divine and made sort of room, as it were, spiritually, I guess, for the world. I don't know if that solves anything, because if you can't understand how the world can exist, does it make it any easier to understand that God constricted himself? So, but that's the idea. The Gra, the Vilna Gaon, Masfir Rayona Tzimtzumi, understands the notion of Tzimtzum, of the contraction of the divine at the plain meaning, which is Or Kedusha Sabore Hatzit Matzam Ba'alfei Dargos B'chol Ha'atzma'im B'chol Ha'atzamim B'olam Aradargos Hanemuch B'yosei, that the holy light of God is sort of diluted through many, many thousands of levels, even to the smallest levels in the world. In other words, that the divine light radiates, whatever that means, even to the most physical things. This evil, which is, that was created as a separate entity. And so there's a clash between good and evil. Goodness is the divine, comes from the divine, and the wickedness is a separate. Now, obviously, this runs into another problem, which is the problem of Shtei Rishiyos, of two gods, two powers. So obviously, the Magon would not say that wickedness has its own power, but it has a purpose against. Wickedness is wickedness. It's wicked, and it has a purpose in the world. What's that purpose? To give human beings free will, free choice, that they can choose good or evil. And in wickedness, in evil, there is no holy light. That's the thing. Evil is evil, right? Once you make evil holy, or have the potential for holiness, you're opening up a very slippery slope to, between us, I think, a Sabbatian world, a world of Shabbat Tzvi. And we have to just keep God's word and do good and resist evil. The purpose of evil in the world is just to resist it. That was God's will. As the pasuk Malach Halarts about this, how do you understand that the world is filled with God's glory? Right? If you understand that the world is really filled with God, so then evil also is filled with God, and evil also has the potential for good. Right? So the Gaon does not buy that. How does he understand it? He understands kvodo, the glory of God, to mean hashgachato, God's divine providence, that God guides the world. That's what it means. God has a plan, but evil is not part of God, or it's not. It doesn't have potential for good. It has the potential for good, and people do good. That's good. The view of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, has a different take on it. What is that? Mitzada mashpia. That here's how, this is very typical of Chabad. Depends from what angle you're looking. From the purview of the divine, which is where the emanation is coming from, Otzemet ha'ein sof lo titachen istalkus gemura. The hatzimtzum hu efo rak biyachas hamakabel hanivra. From God's side, there is no tzimtzum, there is no constriction. There's no place there's nothing that is devoid of the divine. Everything is God, which means that evil is also part of God. But that is from the divine purview. From the purview of the receptor of the human being, so there is tzimtzum. There is, God is constricted, and from our point of view, the wickedness, evil is a place that is devoid of the divine. But that's just from our perspective. From the real perspective, from the divine perspective, God is unlimited. That's from Shner Zalman's take. Makabel masuga lakabel ta'ar rak lefi kosher kibulo. The one who receives the light can only receive the light of the divine according to their own vessel. Rayon shekvar husvar mashal shalom mezrich. The Mezricher Magid, who was the teacher of the Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, has a mashal, there's a parable for this, that when a father, maspir davar lebenoa katan, when a father explains something to a young child, the father constricts his intellect. Matim atzmo the kosher kibula shel yeled, and he makes himself accessible to the child, makes the knowledge accessible to the child in that way. The father, let's say, is a mathematician, but he wants to teach 2 + 2 is 4 to the child. So I thought the father changes. The father compartmentalizes the rest of his knowledge. It's not that the father has changed, the father's intellect has changed. But from the side of the makabel, the receiver, the father is very simple. But it's not the father has really changed. Therefore, the infinite light of God indeed is found everywhere in the world. Even evil is not its own realm. Evil and good get their life force, their force of existence from the same source, God. But evil receives less because it can't receive more. It is the child that can only receive a little bit. But that doesn't mean that God has changed. Obviously, these are very esoteric ideas, and on the surface, it sounds like we're talking about things we know, but we can talk about it all in metaphor. The thing about Kabbalah generally is you talk about things in metaphor: lights, vessels, presence. But you can never actually make the jump from the metaphor to the reality because you can't understand what it means for God to be limited or not limited. So that's how we do it, though, in metaphor. Yotze efo shegam harahu inyan la'anot bo. Kidelit kashem ha'or shabo. There is divine light even in evil, and it can be connected to Valoto, and our job is to raise it up to its source. It sounds like he's saying our job is to find the divine sparks even in evil and to raise it up. When we say, therefore, that God's glory fills the whole world, what it means is kvodo does not mean, like the Vilna Gaon said, that it means hashgachato, God's divine providence, God's divine will. The Rabbi Shner Zalman would say, no, kvoda means oro mamish, God's actual light. What does that mean? The divine, that it fills actually everything. So that's the argument. Now, obviously, neither of them would say God is limited, but yes, the Vilna Gaon might, in the sense that there's divine light and divine emanation that keeps the world going, but that it doesn't extend to evil, and the Rosh Hashanah would say it does. Oh. All right, so it's a very nice introduction. It gives you a good sense. It's not that long. The letter's right here on the next page, but I think it'll help us really understand the letter better. Okay, so it's interesting. I think there's sort of a change here. I think what's interesting is that Chassidut's clearly working, and so the criticism of they're davening the wrong nusach, or they're doing silly things, or they're dancing too much, it doesn't work after it becomes a real movement. Because they're clearly 25 years later, they're clearly religious people. They're clearly so what's emerging is the Gaon has sort of a different problem, a deeper problem with Chasidim. That is a theological problem, which is interesting. Obviously, we live at a time when people don't, it's not like anybody's publicly yelling at each other about whether the divine, is totally immanent or not. maybe some people are, but it doesn't seem to bother the masses of the Jewish people. But it probably didn't at that time either. But obviously, how to understand the Ari's Kabbalah is a very big deal, because the Ari himself was, I think, kind of change in Kabbalah. All right, have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Well.